sometimes,
kind
like
of
you,
like,
sometimes, like you said, it's unfortunately, all you can do is educate them. And then at the end of the day, it's their choice. So sometimes, sometimes you either have to go through a lot of pain or just, one way or the other, right? Either it takes a lot longer or it's, painful on the front end. So, okay, well, let's go ahead and jump right in. So for those of you that maybe don't know me, my name's Troy Marsh. I'm out of the consultant's office in Dublin. And basically the goal of today is to go through a little bit of how I communicate with our buyers and sellers. And then also from my perspective, what does the market look like right now? And being somebody who's been in the business since 2004 and went through the downturn in 2008, I feel like a lot of the general public and even lots of agents who haven't been in the business any time other than when it was booming, wonder, is this just a bubble? And is this a bubble that's going to burst and have a repeat of 2008? So I think last year there was like all this conversation about all the forbearance loans, coming to fruition at once and all these foreclosures happening. And unfortunately, there were a lot of people that sat on the sidelines through the first half of last year expecting to see a wave of foreclosures. It didn't happen, obviously. And so now here we are back kind of in the same place that we were last year at this time. And so what advice do we give to our clients? So I'm going to start with going through just kind of the facts of where we are, and then get into what I believe are the things that we should be keeping an eye on as agents. And then I will open it up to Q&A and answer questions like what Emily just asked. So I'm going to get rolling. Feel free to go ahead and, type stuff in the chat or even unmute and talk. I'd love to answer questions as we go as well. So, all right. So from a market trends perspective, the biggest things that I kind of want to look at today are, where are we at inventory wise? What are interest rates doing? What impact do we feel like that's going to have? Where are we at with new construction? Because obviously that can solve the inventory issue. And then how do all of those things affect affordability? And then I've got, like I said, some conclusions on the things to look at. So as most of you, if not all of you know, inventory and months of supply are at an all-time low across the country. And so I have put together a couple national charts in terms of the first one being newly listed homes. And so if we look at the trends, if you look down here to the key, the different colored lines are actually different years over the last 5 years. And so you can see March, or you can see 2020 when COVID happened. Obviously that's the outlier in terms of the general trend. And then we look at both last year and then so far year to date, we obviously only have numbers through March. We are below in terms of newly listed homes where we had been in 17, 18, and 19. And I'll go through a few reasons why I think that is the case, but just wanted to throw that out there. So nationally, we're down 3.4% year over year for the month of March. I will say in Columbus, Ohio, where the major metro that I'm in, we were actually up about 3% over last year. So you are going to see a variation of a few percentage points, but certainly the available inventory to actually look at is still below where we were last year. So this is the other indicator, which is what I just said, the available inventory in terms of the number of active listings that are available. And you can see that definitely this year and last year were by far the lowest compared to the last 5 or 6 years. And so I think we all can agree that inventory has been an issue. Now, one of the things that we will continue to keep an eye on, that I'll continue to keep an eye on, that typically is what we would call a leading indicator on inventory, are days on market. So we can see that the days on market historically dips during the spring and early summer, which is what we would all expect. Maybe we don't have the data in our back pocket to discuss that with clients. But the goal, again, is to give you guys resources that you can have the data available. And so this is just a really easy chart that shows your average days on market. And so typically it's an inverse. When things do slow down, the days on market go up. So you saw this happen in kind of that May, June timeframe around COVID, when we were all kind of freaking out a little bit. No one knew what was going to happen. But historically, you can see kind of every year outside of that, we've trended down, which is why we're feeling the most pain that we have over the last few years. But when I say that this is a leading indicator, what I mean by that is this is definitely one of those numbers that we absolutely are going to be keeping an eye on as we move into what is likely going to be a slowdown of the overall economy. And I say it's going to be a slowdown just because the Federal Reserve has told us that their goal is to slow the economy down because of inflation. And so how that impacts the housing market and the speed at which that does is the thing that really no one knows. So far, as we'll get into in a second, the interest rates, which is the main lever that the Fed uses to slow the economy, has not really had a major impact, if really any impact, in terms of slowing the housing market. And then median prices, obviously that is the opposite of the rest of them in terms of it's been going up. You can see that March of 2022, the average across the nation was up 13.5% compared to March of 2021. And so any of those poor buyers that you guys have that decided to wait for all the foreclosures last year in the third quarter definitely are not happy that their interest rate is much higher, and so is the purchase price that they're paying for the place that they want to buy. So again, the one thing that I do, and I'll say this several times, there are very few, if any, economists out there that I've heard say that the housing market is in a bubble that's going to burst and turn into 2008 overnight. So I think whenever anybody talks about the housing market right now, it's more of, the what's going to slow or shrink is the rate of appreciation. But that doesn't automatically mean that we're going to go into a depreciation. And I think generally the general public struggles with that differentiation. And so I think that's one thing that we can do with our buyers when talking about the median list price. It doesn't have to be negative in terms of the year over year appreciation in order to see a slowdown in the market. So as inventory and or days on market would increase, we would likely see the rate of growth drop, but that doesn't mean that it's going to go below zero. This is the one interesting thing that I honestly didn't even realize until I started prepping for this presentation, that this stat was tracked. But I think this is one that I'm really keeping my eye on. And I've actually been seeing it in the news, but because they only pretty much give monthly updates on data, it's hard to see like real-time changes in this. But obviously we can do that in our local markets by paying attention to hot sheets and looking at our client searches and things like that. But one interesting thing is when we look at the number of price reductions, we haven't seen them increasing since 2018 at this time of the year, except for this year from February to March, they actually increased 6% actually. Now the year over year increase over March of last year is only 0.2%, so pretty much statistically irrelevant. But the one thing that I will be looking for in April, do we see this number continue to go up in terms of the price reductions? And I think what that will tell us is that the market is beginning to push back on sellers just pricing at whatever they feel like pricing at and being a more market-based approach. honestly, I was involved in a negotiation this weekend on a property that, in my opinion, a month and a half ago would have flown off the shelves no matter what it was priced at, where it sat on the market for a few days. Now it's still got multiple offers. However, I think that we're starting to feel this, and I think we're going to feel it more at the higher price ranges, and that's going to be an impact of interest rates. People just aren't going to be willing to increase their payment at the rate that they were willing to, just because there's got to be something in it. This particular house, it was 17-year-old house, all original mechanicals, all original roof, really no cosmetic updates and no finished basement in the 700 range. And the buyers just weren't excited enough to extremely overpay. Whereas on the contrary, the week before, Emily, your team's listing that was extremely updated, where they had done everything, and that sold for well over what it was listed for, and well over what anything else in the neighborhood had sold for. So I think we might be entering a time where pricing listings becomes a little bit more of a science again, which would be a welcome for those of us who are good agents, because that's when it actually makes a difference who lists their house, which is good for us as an industry. When people can just throw a dart at the dartboard and it's going to sell no matter what, it's not good for our value proposition. So anyways, back to the price reductions. It's just a number that I want to keep an eye on, because as this potentially trends upward, in a different manner than what we've seen in years past, it could be an indication that the market is beginning to slow a little bit. I would say certainly the conversation of the year so far has absolutely been interest rates. Again, I got licensed in 2004, so I was right on the tail end. I got licensed in August of 2004, so I was right on the tail end of kind of the boom. Things definitely started to slow down by the end of 2005 and definitely into 2006. But we were in a rising interest rate environment at that point, which many of you on this call may have never been in. If you've just been in the industry for 5 years or less, it's been relatively flat in terms of interest rates over the last 5 years. And I've never seen rates go up as quickly as they have over the beginning of this year. And so the impact on a buyer who's been looking, writing offers, but not winning offers, the impact in their payment is actually pretty significant, especially when you put it in combination with the rising prices. And so when we talk about this, here's just a quick graph of historical trends. But the one thing that I thought was interesting when I was prepping for this, and I do a lot, if you guys have ever caught any of my market updates, but one thing that I thought was interesting is that prior to 2009, we had never dipped below 5% on the 30-year fixed, which I feel like as a society, like we feel like 5% is high. And yet literally no one had ever paid 5% or less until 2009. So we're putting that into perspective. But one of the things that the Federal Reserve is very concerned about is that basically they've trained us to be used to those low rates. And so they're really worried and like kind of nervous as to how the economy is going to react to higher rates, because we've been in this territory, after having never been there. Now we've almost been there for the last 10, 11 years, other than this small blip. I think that was in 2017 for like a month. And so it'll be interesting to see what impact this has on consumer confidence. Certainly it's not going to be positive in terms of growth, but again, the Fed is really trying to slow the economy down because of inflation right now. So, but this is just a quick chart, and this is something that I would absolutely talk to your buyers about. So I think whenever I'm talking to a buyer or talking to a coaching client, the biggest thing that I think we are sometimes lazy with, because we get really excited about having a buyer seller, we don't often properly assess motivation. And so I think one thing that I would do if I were you with buyers in particular is go back and establish what is their motivation for every one of them. And if you can't go through a list of your buyers and identify that by writing it down, I would go back and ask them, so what happens if you don't buy a house this year? And if they say, oh, well, then I'll just keep renting, or, oh, well, I'll just stay in my house, then I think you have to be really realistic with what your pipeline looks like, right? Because I don't know if your pipeline looks much like mine, but I have a very full pipeline of people that in a normal year would have already transacted real estate. But their motivation level doesn't reach the place that they need to, and therefore they're waiting for this fictitious thing. Now, in the situation where somebody needs to buy, this chart is super, super valuable in my opinion. This is what has happened to the payment of the corresponding loan just since the beginning of this year. So if you have a $500,000 buyer, their payment has gone up by $439 per month. Now multiply 439 times 12, and then multiply it times 30. And use big numbers, or multiply it by 4. Like, ask them, how long do you see yourself living in this house? And then ask them based on the news articles, and you can go type in, will interest rates keep rising in Google, and identify 5, 10, 20 different news articles. Send them an email with all the links to Forbes and CNBC and all of those, Wall Street Journal, all of those places that are respected by a buyer, and ask them, do you think the rates are going to go down, stay the same, or go up over the next 6 months? And then when they come and they say, well, I don't want to overpay by 10 grand, ask them, what happens if rates go up by 0.25% on your $500,000 mortgage? And then multiply that by the next 3 years of mortgage payments, and it's probably going to be more than 10 grand. So the question isn't, I think too often we get buyers and sometimes agents, we tend to get pretty emotional with these decisions. And I think sometimes narrowing it down and getting the facts out there and take the emotion out of it, because frankly, that's our job as agents, is to take the emotion out of the decision and talk about fact. This is a great place to encourage people. Now, at the end of the day, Emily, and I know we're going to get into Q&A, whether somebody wants to buy a house with or without a home inspection, the facts probably say they should get a home inspection. So can't help you with that. But one of the things that we can do is, maybe it's, instead of not being willing to pay for the home inspection ahead of writing the offer, is it worth $200 now to save yourself $200 per month in your mortgage payment if rates go up? That's a different way to look at it. This is another indicator that I'm definitely keeping my eye on in terms of demand, is the mortgage applications. So I'm going to give you the websites where I got all this information from, so you guys can grab it. This stuff is all free out there for you to download and look at whenever you want. But these are the mortgage applications compared to mortgage rates, and split into refinances versus purchase. And so you can see that obviously as rates have gone up, the amount of refinances has gone down, because it makes less sense for everybody to refinance. And but then you can see that purchase applications actually are kind of holding firm. Obviously, they're a little bit lower than last year, but not by much. And so this is definitely something that we'll continue to keep an eye on. One of the other numbers, which we don't have a ton of data on because the numbers have been so small, and I think statistically still not super relevant, but one of the interesting things to keep an eye on too are the number of buyers that are using adjustable rate mortgages in order to offset the increase in interest rates, meaning that by doing a 5-1 ARM, which means your rate is only fixed for 5 years and then it can adjust, they're doing that in order to keep the same rate that they would have had 3 months ago if they would have done a 30-year fixed. That does introduce a degree of risk into the market, which is one of the big things that happened in 2008. And so if we see those percentages increasing, that's also another thing that we'll want to keep an eye on. The other thing is that jumbo rates are definitely still having a pretty good gap between conforming and jumbo rates. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Jumping into new construction, building permits. So if you want to know exactly why we're in the situation we are with inventory, this is pretty much the slide that explains it all. If we look at how many building permits were happening per year nationally from 2000 to 2007, and look at the fact that we've just barely reached where we were at the beginning of that trend, just here in the last year, but this is what we've been experiencing over the last 10 years. You can see why we have so few houses. Every single year we lose houses to fire, we lose people, tear them down, whatever. And we just have not been building at a rate that's sufficient, especially if you're in a growing area like we are here in Columbus, where we're increasing in population, and then we're also building less houses than we were before. So obviously supply and demand works pretty simply with that. So these are building permits. And then we've also got housing starts. You're looking at exactly the same thing. In 2006 and 7, we were peaking out at, 2,000 or 2 million housing starts. And we've basically been the last couple of years at 1.5 million, but we spent a lot of time 1 million. So we were more than half of what we had been doing for, quite some time. And so this was precipitated initially in the downturn because we had such a huge supply of foreclosures that hit the market all at one time. So that made up for the lack of supply on the new construction front, but we really have never caught up, frankly, to where we were. And for any of you, like Emily, I know you were in new construction and remember what it was like in 2004, 5, 6, 7. I mean, there were so many opportunities, and we're just not even anywhere near that right now. So these are some of the other numbers that we're looking at, kind of comparison wise. So completions were up from January to February by 5.9%. So that's good. That's trending in the right direction. The incomplete units is up in February with the 2022 compared to February 21. By more than 300,000. So part of that number is a result of the supply chain issue. And another part of that number is also that there have been more housing starts. So that's good. One thing that was interesting, and we'll see if it's just a blip in the radar, but multifamily permits are down, which at least in most of the country, rents, there's not a lot of vacancy. So that's an interesting number, which unfortunately, if there's fewer multifamily properties coming on the market, then it's going to lead to even more supply issues. So that's an interesting thing. And then housing starts overall, though, like I said, we're up 22% in February compared to last year, February. So overall, the new construction stats are moving in the right direction. For any of you who are involved in new construction, I would say the biggest pain points there are definitely supply, material supplies, and then also labor supplies. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of reprieve on the short-term horizon, at least for either of those things, in my opinion, as labor inflation is going to cause the need for labor costs to keep going up, which is going to make the prices continue to rise, at least in the short term. This is another one that I did not know they tracked, but I've heard the number thrown around, but I had never seen a graph like this. And this is basically affordability when looked at your monthly payment compared to the median income. So this is showing your and what percentage that creates. So basically, most mortgages like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae like to see your housing costs be at 30% or less of your total income. So that's what this number kind of here is. And you can see the only time from an affordability perspective nationally that we got over the payment to income ratio of over 30% was 2005, 6, and 7. And look where we are today, right below that number. So this is something that definitely everybody has their eye on, because as soon as we see affordability start to get to the balance gets too far out of whack, the general public just can't afford it anymore. And so typically that's gonna create a softening. And obviously with rising rates, that's what has caused this immediate jump. Now the question is, will wages as a result of inflation catch up with that, or will wages continue to lag behind and therefore continue to make affordability a bigger issue? I did not include it in the slides, but definitely Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, the Midwest is definitely the most affordable area in the country. I mean, certainly when you compare ours to, the West, East Coast, and then also Texas, has just been experiencing, I think Austin was up 35% year over year in terms of prices. So we haven't seen that much of an impact here, or as much of an impact here, but certainly I think locally here in Columbus, we've definitely begun to see affordability have an impact a little bit, certainly in the first-time home buyer segment of the market. So ultimately, my conclusion is that I think most experts agree that the housing bubble will slowly deflate. And this is mostly supported by the fact that it's driven by low supply and high demand. Whereas in 2008, we had underlying mortgage softness as well as an oversupply caused by the overbuilding. And so I feel bullish on the market as a whole from the perspective that I think that it's still a good time to buy a house versus waiting. I think just like last year, a lot of people are going to find themselves waiting and then ending up paying more, whether that is on a monthly payment perspective or an overall price perspective, or both is probably the most likely scenario. And they're also missing out on the appreciation that is happening in the moment, right? So even if you're overpaying by a little bit, but every time you quote unquote overpay in the neighborhood, then now you just set a new floor for appraisers moving forward. And so as long as you're not the highest sale ever in the neighborhood, and then the market floor falls out next week, which is what everybody's afraid of, you're probably going to be in a pretty good position, especially if you're a long-term buyer. And I tend to equate it to the stock market. This investment representatives have been using this forever, and I think it holds true. And if anything, this is the one benefit that I think comes from 2008, even though the fear creates a lot more downside. But the one silver lining that we have from 2008 is that we can say everything goes up and goes down. And so the reality is, I think that a lot of people, because housing, at least in Central Ohio, had never gone down that way, there was this fear that it was never going to come back up. And if I could give one piece of advice to any buyer in the market right now, is that as long as you are okay staying there or keeping it as a rental property, there's really very little risk in the long term for buying in any market. Because if you keep it long enough, inflation saves you at the very least. But in the short term, you're losing out on all of the tax benefits, as well as, at least in Central Ohio, you're paying a ton for rent during that time. So if you see yourself being a buyer in the next 2 to 3 years, I don't think that it makes sense to wait. So what am I looking for in the market? I mentioned some of them when I was going through it, but I'm looking for lowering lending standards. So as soon as there's more ARMs, adjustable rate mortgages being doled out, as soon as we start to see stated income loans coming back in, And I think some of this is going to be driven by loan officers who were making half of their money or sometimes more from refinances. And now those refinances went from being 50% of the mortgage volume to zero, and purchases have just stayed steady. So there's some mortgage lenders, loan officers out there who just got a 50% pay cut in the last 2 months. So if you've noticed them reaching out to you a little bit more lately, that's why, because their paycheck just got cut in half. I'm also looking at higher days on market and more price reductions as a leading indicator, and then overbuilding, which I don't think is going to be an issue at all in the short term. And then the last thing is that affordability graph getting out of control. So I think those are the main things that you want to look at. And I just think my encouragement to you as agents is to really become, Gary Keller always said, he said it forever, is become the local economist of choice. Meaning be the person that when your clients have a question about the economy, they come and ask you. Because when things soften or when they need an agent that understands the market, you want to be the person that they turn to. You don't want to be the person that, that just puts a sign in the yard, puts it in the MLS and prays that it's going to sell. Because in a changing market, the clients are looking for somebody that can understand and explain this stuff. And especially if you're somebody wanting to raise your average sales price, when you're working with people that have more money, typically they tend to be more likely to be in either upper level management or business owners, and they have to understand this stuff to run their business, and therefore they expect you to as well. And so that would be my advice. Sources, mortgagenewsdaily.com is one that I would encourage all of you to go to and sign up for their daily feed. They send out one email a day, and it just tells you what happened with mortgage rates that day. But I got all of the interest rate data off of there, all of the building permit data, all of that stuff was on there. All from Mortgage News Daily. And they have, the cool thing about Mortgage News Daily is that they also write it and explain all the data to you. And so I think it's a great tool. It's one email a day that you can just go in and kind of read and get some talking points. I mean, there's many times where I'll just fire off an email with a link to the article to my clients, and it makes me look like I know what I'm talking about. And it takes 30 seconds, right? Realtor.com, I had never, again, until looking at this, I hadn't seen those graphs that they produce, but they're super easy to cut and paste. And they're branded with Realtor.com, which is what it is, whatever. But I think those are all good things to go back and look at every month. And then here in Central Ohio, we have a website called trendgraphics.com. I think it's a national thing. I don't know, for those of you who are on here from Kentucky or Indiana, I don't know if you guys have access to this or not, but certainly another website that I would recommend using. So with that, that's kind of the end of my prepared presentation. What, if any, questions do you guys have for me or discussion points?
Okay, I got a question. So in your opinion, knowing that, and I agree with what's going to happen is with interest rates going up, you're going to start to see more ARM programs. The lenders are going to start to ease up, and they're going to come back out with stated loans again. Knowing that, that's what got us in trouble and got us into the issue back in 2005, 2006, 2007. Do you think that we're leaning towards something like that happening again?
Well, I think that's, we're hypothesizing at this point that that's what's going to happen. So until it happens, I think it's dangerous to assume. It's also, the reality is that stuff was already happening in 2004 when I got my license, and we didn't have a crash until 2008. So I think the chances of beginning, I think the stats are something like 95% or something of all loans in the last several years have been 30-year fixed mortgages. I also think the other thing, and again, I can only speak to Central Ohio on this. I haven't like compared the national graphs, but I know we weren't experiencing nearly the appreciation in 2004, 5, 6 that we have over the last couple of years. And so I don't think that the average homeowner was in an equity position. And so I think all of those things kind of happened. The other thing that we had happening, which I don't think is going to come back, is the subprime market, those were 2-year adjustable rate mortgages with 100% financing with people. I mean, there were programs out there for down to a 500 credit score. And the whole program was based on the idea that this person that had been very irresponsible with credit was all of a sudden in the next 2 years going to turn over a new leaf. And I mean, realistically, the person that thought that up wanted to sell mortgages, but anybody with a brain, when was the last time that anybody bought a house and didn't go out and buy stuff that they didn't buy before? You know, furniture for the new house, you know, patio furniture, all the stuff. And so the idea that this person was not going to go out and open up another credit card and just get more and more in debt. And then at the same time, those adjustable rate mortgages were coming due, interest rates were rising, and then everyone was losing their jobs. So again, I do think that's why one of those things is if we see higher risk programs start to come out again, we will definitely raise the alarm bells. But I think some safety features are in place at this point. It happened actually with the second home market. The percentages of loans that were being issued for second homes got to a level, and it was about 6 or 8 months ago that they came out, Fannie and Freddie came out and added a bunch of extra fees onto those mortgages. And now those dropped like 15% last month. I think some of it is due to COVID. People don't have time to go to their vacation homes anymore because kids' sports and all that stuff are back in play. But I also think some of it is because they made it more expensive. And so that's just a trigger that they learned from 2008, that they don't want any more than X% of the whole portfolio of loans that they're giving out to be in these certain segments. And so as long as we succeed in having those, you know, regulatory alarm bells in place, I think that will be in at this point, I feel like overall the lending environment is still way more conservative than it needs to be in order to still have a healthy environment. I mean, there's some common sense things with the percentage of people in the US that are business owners. The fact that it's so hard to get a loan as a business owner, that's something that I think, you know, intelligence. If somebody has a bunch of money sitting in the bank, or they have a big stock portfolio or something, like they're just not historically likely to default on the house that they're living in. And I think that those programs, that's where I think we probably could see, like you said, with the stated income. But the reality is, if somebody has a 700 credit score, they're not likely to start not paying bills. They're probably pretty responsible with their money. We were giving stated income loans to people with way lower credit scores. And again, I think the credit score driven, you know, if we start to see those first time home buyer loans come back where people don't have any skin in the game and they don't have good credit profiles, that's where the alarm bells should be going off. What else? Anybody else have questions, comments? Curious as to how to bring this into your day-to-day world in real estate?
Something a little off topic slightly.
Okay.
Can you speak at all to how Intel moving into Columbus might affect the local housing market?
Yep, I'll get to that in just a second. Joe, what were you going to ask?
Yeah, it's Ash here. I'm in the training room with Joe.
Okay.
I was actually at dinner with Mayor Ginther last week.
Oh, look at you.
This may even help the previous question. As you know, they're up for re-election. one of the main tickets he's running on is affordability at all levels. Now, I thought it was very interesting that he said at all levels. And when I press him on it, he said he's talking to private sectors because he realizes with Intel and other top 500 companies moving into Columbus, that there's a shortage of housing at all levels, not only at the under 200s, at the top level as well. So he's talking with private sector for investment. And when I pressed him on, well, what about the availability of land in your area as opposed to surrounding areas? And that's when he turned around and spoke to me how he's talking to Union County, Fairfield, Licking, and all different counties to try to get them to come in on board on his idea of rezoning areas. So freeing up areas for more housing. And then what we've got here in Dublin, we've got I believe it's a Pulte development. It was a heated discussion, I believe, between Dublin City Council and Pulte for whether it be over 55s or whether it be open to all. And this is a common issue with especially Olentangy and Dublin schools, that everyone's wanting to move into the areas for the schooling. And as we know, with the building of new high schools, new elementaries and everything, they just don't want to keep building them all the time, even though they should. With the new one on Emerald Parkway, and then a few years ago, Berlin High School opening up, and then the rezoning for Powell. And some people are unhappy that their students are closer to Liberty, and now they're going to Berlin and everything. So those schooling districts are taking a forward step. So this over 55s, I can't remember whether they've given the go-ahead for it as an over 55s with no one allowed to go to the schools from that area, or a set number or percentage of people from that area. I can't remember. I did read it a few months ago in the Dublin City Councils. So yeah, getting back to Mayor Ginther, he turned around and said that it was affordability at all levels. So he's trying to take the forward step, I believe, with Intel and other companies coming into the area, that he realizes it's just not the tax abatement areas and that need to be taken care of. It is the executives, because if they don't have housing, are they going to bring their companies here, even though they know how affordable living in Columbus is? So.
Right. No, that's a good point. Anybody else? I know we have some non-Columbus people on the Zoom, so I was going to answer more general questions, and then I would definitely love to dig into the Intel thing, because I don't have an exact answer, but I have some theories. Anybody else have questions about the overall economics or understanding your market, or comments, anything that anybody else has done really well, or that any information that I didn't have included that you guys think is good to share?
Hey, it's Sarah Weber. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Good. Hey, I just am curious, and I know obviously no one has a crystal ball. What some of you all are thinking, like where we could see interest rates going in the next couple months, with how quickly we've seen them go up in the last month or two. Like, what are your all's thoughts on that? I know Gary Keller said expect them to go to 10%. What are you all thinking? Every time I ask like some of my local lenders, they're like, oh no, it'll just maybe go up another 0.5%. And I'm like, really? Even though it went up like 3% in the last 3 months. So I want to draw thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll go first, but I'd love to get to the short answer is I don't know all of it gets pretty deep in terms of predicting where things are going to go. I think there's a lot of variables. I think people like Gary, he started in real estate in the late 70s. And so his reference point with interest rates and inflation is certainly the early 80s, when they were as high as 18%. So, I think there is some disagreement among economists as to whether that's a realistic, like whether they could go up that much. Well, obviously they can go up that much, but whether they will, and whether, more importantly, whether the Fed will allow them to go up that much. You know, because of the fact that we're in somewhat uncharted territories, anybody that says they know what's going to happen, I think be careful, because I don't think anybody knows. I don't know of anyone that was predicting that they were going to already be at 5%, even at the beginning of the year. I think, frankly, even Gary at family reunion was saying that they were going to stay like, you know, maybe 5% by the end of the year. And now and that's what most people were saying, that, you know, they're probably going to be in the 4s and, you know, maybe 5% by the end of the year. And now, you know, they've really been at 5% since the end of March. So I'll stop talking now. Anybody else have any insights into interest rates and predictions that they've heard?
Well, I know that they announced on the news this morning on Today Show that they're expecting 6 more rate hikes this year. So I know that much. That's what the Fed's announced. So knowing that, I mean, what a rate hike could be, what, 1/8% and higher?
Yeah, I think the other distinction, though, remember that short-term rates are what the Fed is raising, and long-term rates are what mortgages, you know, obviously 30-year mortgages based off of the Treasury. So I think typically the rates move in the same direction as the market, because basically when people are getting out of stocks, they tend to go towards more conservative investments, which are usually bonds and treasuries. And so, but again, yeah, the borrowing costs, I mean, the overall trend of the interest rate market is going to remain the same. And that's where, to be honest, it gets a little bit over my head. As to, you know, it doesn't have a direct correlation in terms of mortgage rates versus what the Fed does, but certainly the trend of rates overall, I feel like, tends to follow. And I'm sure there's some very technical reason for that. But anybody else have? So you heard that rates are going to 6 more rate hikes this year, which is significant. That's way more than what they had originally said at the beginning of the year.
Mhm.
Anybody else before I move on to Intel? No? Okay, cool. Well, I guess for those of you who are remaining, who are in Columbus or just curious on it, I think just like what Ash said, I mean, ultimately, I think one of the biggest challenges with building, especially the affordable housing, which I would call like sub 500, which is crazy, but that's kind of where we are, is definitely municipalities. That's why I think you have seen an increase in people moving to more rural communities that just have decent schools, because of the fact that municipalities are just so involved in the planning to like what kind of exterior materials are on houses. I mean, in 2004 and 2005, I mean, go just do a year built search in the MLS and look at the outsides of houses, like all the Dominion and MI products that were all vinyl siding. Like there's almost no communities anywhere now where you can build a house and have all vinyl siding. Like every neighborhood requires some part of natural, like whether it's stone, brick, or hardy plank. And a lot of them require multiple sides even for that. So just those costs alone and what they do to the prices. And then many municipalities also require minimum square footage. You know, and this is done, it's not like they passed a law that says like you can't build a house in Dublin that's less than 2,000 square feet. But what happens in the zoning committee meetings when Dublin's approving turning a farm field into a neighborhood is the developer has to go in front of the zoning board and say, this is what the houses are going to look like. This is going to be the size. This is going to be the lot size. This is how many acres of parks we're going to have in the community, all of that stuff. And that's where the zoning boards, and part of it is driven by what Ash is saying. They're trying to limit the number of people that are attending the schools because of the cost. And so they're trying to get more tax dollars per house. And therefore, you know, in theory, they have to build less schools, because if you build, you know, if you have one house that has 2 kids that go to the schools and it's worth 700,000 versus one house that has 2 kids that go to the schools and it's worth 250, your tax dollars brought in from that one house are significantly more or less, but it's still the same number of students. So certainly there's financial drivers for that stuff, but the reality is that we just can't continue to go at the pace that we're going without having major issues. So I think it's, I was at the board last week for the MLS committee meeting, and Tony Macaluso was there, and he's on the builder or relations committee. I can't, maybe that's not the perfect, it's not the title of it, but something like that. And basically what he's trying to organize between now and the end of the year is getting all the builders and all the municipalities together, which I'm sure is what Mayor Ginther is going to do too, getting all of them together and having them talk to each other and explain what the challenges are and try to work through, put together a plan that helps work through some of these roadblocks, because frankly, going again at the pace that we are right now just isn't sustainable. And with Intel, I mean, the estimates I've heard is 5,000 to 7,000 additional homes needed over the next 5 years per year in order to support because you've got the 3,500, at least to start, like full-time workers that are here to work at Intel. But those average salaries are 135,000 just for that job. So if they have a working spouse, then their income's even more. Those level of jobs tend to create needs for the, you know, they're going to go eat at restaurants, they're going to need grocery stores. And so all of their needs kind of filter through the community, which is why communities like to have, you know, employers of this size. But when we're already in a housing crunch, in a major way from an inventory perspective, it creates a dilemma that is definitely not an easy solution. And the time frame, you know, like the fact that that's supposed to be open in 3 years, I just don't know. Developments typically take 1 to 3 years just to get off the ground from conception to, you know, selling the first house, because you have to go through zoning, and then you have to get the development done with the sewers and the streets and all that. Then the builder has to sell, you know, and then they have to build. And so each one of those phases usually takes 6 to 12 months. And so, you know, 2 years is usually like a really efficient, quick one from conception to building, but usually it's probably more like 3. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. Oh, Diane just left. I was going to ask her about building, but anybody else have any opinions or not inside knowledge on Intel that you've heard, or numbers that you've heard thrown around? No? All right, awesome. Well, hey guys, thank you so much for hopping on. If you want a copy of the slide deck, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share. So just email me at troyre@gmail.com and I will be happy to send that on to you. See you guys.